Thank you, Stephanie. I think I know like half of you out that are here. This is so great. I want to remind everyone to just pop out your mic and turn it on so you're ready to jump into action. And I should add to the introduction, we are all moms. We're all awesome Jewish moms. So having outed ourselves with that, I wanted to just ask how many moms are in the audience right now. Okay, almost everybody. How many Jewish moms? Okay. How many of you are caring for somebody? It could be a child, it could be an elder, it could be a friend, anyone else caring for someone right now in your life. And how many of you have Jewish moms? Okay. Excellent. Well, with that, Elissa has some things to share with you.
I do. So tonight we're going to try to reimagine the Jewish mom and break away from some of the stereotypes we've all been carrying with us from Portnoy's Complaint and Woody Allen movies and wherever else you get your Jewish mom stereotypes. To quickly establish those stereotypes, I thought I'd share some Jewish mom jokes with you. Many of them are well known. They might be familiar. And as with all humor, there is a grain of truth in some of these. And there's also a lot of misogynistic BS.
Elissa, I feel like you should stand up and like pace a little. And
All right, Lauren, I'm gonna
see if anyone knows the answer.
Miss Maisel,
yeah, a little,
coming
exactly.
out or
There we go.
something. All right, I've never done stand-up before, so bear with me, folks. All right, I don't know if I'm a pacing comic. I think, but I can gesture, you know. All right, how many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? None. I'll sit in the dark. What's the difference between a Jewish mother and a vulture? The vulture will wait until you're dead before it tears your heart out. A twist on that one. What's the difference between a Jewish mother and a Rottweiler? The Rottweiler leaves the child alone at the end. So we're getting a little theme here where Jewish mothers are difficult. They expect a lot of their kids. A Jewish mother sends her son a red sweater and a blue sweater for Hanukkah. He is soon going to visit her, but can't figure out which sweater to wear. Having become completely stressed, he finally chooses the blue sweater, puts it on, and heads for his mother's house. She opens the door, and instead of making sure he arrived all right, simply asks him, "What, you didn't like the red sweater?" Moishe calls his mom and asks her how she is. She replies, "Very well, thanks." Moishe responds, "Oh, sorry, I must have dialed the wrong number." I don't relate to that one at all. All right. One comedian imagined what it would be like if famous figures from history had Jewish mothers. Christopher Columbus's Jewish mother. "I don't care what you've discovered. You didn't call, you didn't write." Michelangelo's Jewish mother. "A ceiling you paint? Not good enough for you, the walls, like the other children? Do you know how hard it is to get that schmutz off the ceiling?" And we'll finish with Abraham Lincoln's Jewish mother. This one's my favorite. "Again with the hat? Why can't you wear a baseball cap like the other kids?"
Round of applause for Elissa Strauss, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So Elissa, where does this come from? Why are we the butt of so many jokes? I mean, that's just a very short list in the long list of taking aim at mothers, Jewish ones specifically.
And I'm eager to hear everyone else add to this, but I think it really comes from a combination of a genuine anxiety for Jewish mothers in America to ensure that their kids fit in, and balancing that with a deep generational trauma of like assuming the worst, and then feeling a little bit resentful on top of it.
Feeling a little resentful of their mothers?
No, I think of of the effort that protecting their children takes.
Okay.
I was also just going to, when I think about it, there is also a way in which the Jewish mother type in American pop culture is the mother type in pop movies, TV shows, and Netflix series. So there's some odd way in which the Jewish mother is carrying the negative visibility of the mother figure for a much broader population than the Jews. So it's something we could also just think about more generally as to why there are Jewish types that do the social work of much broader circles than just the Jewish one.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, something that I was thinking a lot about as I'm listening to those jokes and sort of what the themes are of those jokes. It's like the themes are Jewish mothers are intrusive. Jewish mothers are sort of cannibalistic. Jewish mothers are incredibly, are too worried. And then I think about like everything that we culturally, as humans of this moment, want to disavow about ourselves. And it's, we want to disavow our vulnerability. We want to disavow our dependency. So we give it all to the mother. And we give it all to the mother, across the board. And then the Jewish mother gets it's like the mother in that way. And so everything we want to say we don't have, the Jewish mother then typifies.
So you've written about and you've deeply studied these these feelings and fears of motherhood that are maybe at the root of the way the mother behaves. So like, is this something that we're putting on ourselves, or is this something that society is putting on us? You've talked to the moms.
I've talked to the moms, including this one internally. Yeah, I think it's always an ongoing conversation, right? Like what we're putting on ourselves is happening within society. What's happening within society is enabled by each of us individually to some extent. It's a constant back and forth. But I think, I guess the way that there are so many things I could say to that. I guess the thing that's popping out at me right now, thinking about that balance of like, are we sort of blaming ourselves as opposed to saying like, society, you're letting us down? I'm thinking about how society makes us the fall guy, and how like in the way that like when you think about a child and what a child does with their feelings that are just too big for them. Like, what do? They have a tantrum. And then the parent has to do something with the tantrum. Or the teenager, like, doesn't know what to do with, like, this moment of, like, intense identity reformation and whatever else is going on, independence. And, they act out against their parent and makes the parent sort of metabolize the feelings for them. And I think that happens on a societal level as well with sort of the role of mother. We all do that. We all, even the mothers, participate in that because we want to be able to blame our own mothers. That's a very important thing we all want to do. And then we also, as individuals, take in those myths, those cultural stories we tell ourselves, and we make it even more difficult for ourselves. So it's a constant back and forth. I don't know if there's a cop-out, but.
Yeah, and just want to add that this Jewish mother stereotype here was written largely by men. Again, this like Philip Roth, Woody Allen, et cetera, 20th century Jewish masculine vision of the Jewish mother. And I think to tag along with what Yael's saying, if you think of like the Jewish trajectory in America of longing to belong, it's like you got to reject, and the person to reject is the mother. Yeah. They are the shtetl that's like, what are you doing? What's come here? Why are you wearing lipstick? Like that nagging, like subconscious that's telling you don't belong is personified in the Jewish mother.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So would you say this is something that's like from the beginning of time that we've just continued to carry forward in this sort of ongoing wave effect? I mean, you study the ancient texts, Deena? What do you think?
Well, what excited me and Elissa's book is really kind of helped frame a lot of these things is obviously we are shaped by our contexts and our culture. And one thing that we can do is to, I took a little note, create new narratives around care. And another comment Elissa makes is time to stop seeing caring for others as an obstacle to the good life and to start seeing it as an essential part of a meaningful one. And so like the pivot tonight in many ways is, okay, so what icons of care can we introduce? And if you asked in terms of historically speaking, I always, care, we all need care. Winnicott, the psychoanalyst of the post-World War II era, he had a lot of direct experience with children traumatized in the UK from having left London during the air bombardments and having lost contact with family, and that experience for him made him very attuned to how important intact and proper attachment is in healthy development for a child. And he's famous for having said, and Elissa mentions this in her book too, that there's no such thing as a baby. There is only a baby and someone. And when you think about it, even just for a second, you realize how true that is. Human infants are born in such utterly dependent, almost incapacitated ways. And so that network, that bond of dependence for the human species is much more acute than for all other, certainly even mammals. But of course, when you move out of the mammalian family, the offspring is off right at the start. And so here we all need care. This is true, to survive, to expose a baby. We have mixed age in the room, so I won't finish the sentence. So we all need care, and so it is universal, but it is not provided in the abstract. It's provided in culturally specific ways. So in those first months and years of life, when you are entirely dependent and developing in relationship to your immediate environment and in relationship to the network of relations providing for you in that necessary, constant way, those are the months and years in which you're becoming who you are as a person. I'm very interested always in the ideas of somebody named Moshe Feldenkrais, a body worker, but also a theorist on human development. And he has this notion that in the first months and years of life, we become who we are as a person. And we stay that way. Whether we then go on to study medicine or thermodynamics or to get a PhD, all of that learning, he's very dismissive of it, actually. The most important school of life is what happens in those first years. And it unfolds in very culturally specific ways. And so when you think about the beginnings of Jewishness, let's not look for Jewish learning when the child pivots away from the household. By then, it's a done deal, basically. And it's done in relation to the maternal figure. So one of the ways in response to Elissa's call to introduce new narratives and to call upon the historical perspective to make sense of that, to say all through our history in many different regions and over time, Jewishness has been produced in family contexts. And so we need to start to think of the maternal relationship, but also just household relationships more broadly as a central node in the making of Jewish culture.
I'm just thinking back to the little descriptions that I would get of my kids from preschool. So, we just send them off at whatever, 3 or 4 years old, and reading those now, so they're now 18 and 21, they're the same. I mean, that's it. Like the descriptions could have been written yesterday and not 15, 16, 17 years ago. So clearly, I mean, I buy what you're selling. I think it's really true. And I think I love that your book coming out is called Mother's Milk, because it really just gets to that visceral connection. And by the way, my mom is here. There she is over there. And you write about how none of us want to think about the fact that we might have nursed. But and I don't, but we did, and I think it's if it's something that you're able to do with your children, it's a vital connection. If you're not, there's so many other things that are happening in those first 5 years. So, but the other thing that's happening, I think this kind of back to this anxiety thing, like this thing that we carry with us and that we bring from generation to generation, that we project then onto our children. You guys, Elissa and Yael, had a conversation where you talked about the notion of the worrier, but how it sounds like warrior. And I checked it with Siri. So if you say to Siri, hey, what's the definition of worrier? Just after this, just see what happens, okay? It came up warrior for me. And I love this idea of turning this notion on its head, changing the narrative. And Yael, you wrote an entire book about turning it into a superpower. So tell us where that came from, and what what you think that can do for us as a society writ large.
I don't know that worry itself can entirely, as someone who is very tired right now because she was up worrying at 3 a.m., I don't know that I would call it entirely a superpower. But I think, in the possibilities in my most recent book that is about maternal anxiety very much, what I was really interested in, and also what I'm so interested in, when I see patients, when I'm working with parents, is this question, exactly what you raised about sort of changing the narrative, and particularly the narrative about our anxiety, about our worry, and not treating it as something that either controls us or that we use to control our children, because it is so easy to fall into either one. But instead to take it as something interesting, as interesting information to be curious about. And it always has such interesting information in it. I mean, when you think about, what are the themes, like what are the perseverating worries that come up for you again and again, those crack open depths. They really do. You learn things about yourself, you learn things about your child, you learn things about what's happening between the two of you, that if you just sort of stick in the worry, and treat it as uninteresting, you will never learn. And I think that this is sort of the crux, or one crux of changing the narrative around motherhood, Jewish motherhood in particular, worried motherhood in particular, is changing the narrative around how interesting to find a mother's worry and a worried mother. I think that we think of a worried mother as culturally as the most boring thing in the world. She's someone to either roll your eyes at or to say like, oh yeah, of course, like that's the most natural thing in the world, but not something to be interested about. And I think that really changes how we experience our worry. We experience it as something uninteresting then. But if we can sort of treat ourselves as interesting and our worry as interesting, then it becomes this vital source of information that we can use to get to know our kids, to get to know ourselves, to navigate moment to moment. And so if there is sort of a superpower element to it, it's that. It's attuning to our children and our world and ourselves.
Well, Elissa, you write in the book how we take care for granted, that we don't actually understand like the rich resource that giving care can be for other parts of our lives. And I just loved reading, and I would say reading you talk about this, which is not like, that makes no sense. But but I know
me. Maybe it felt like
I can't remember
talking.
if it's a conversation or I read it or what. But how your work life and your mom life you thought would need to be completely separated, and that you went in with this sort of feminist ideal of independence and came out with this realization that that's bunk, basically, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that journey?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I wanted to be a mom. I was lucky I didn't have postpartum depression. I had an easy time connecting with my kids. I had an easy time loving my kids, but I had this real sense that like motherhood could ruin the rest of your life if you let it. It can make you uncool, unserious. It could ruin your work. In literary circles, to be ambivalent or even take a kind of rejecting posture towards motherhood was very much in fashion when I had my first son in 2012. So I went into motherhood thinking like I'm gonna do this. Had my first son's name is Augie. Loved Augie, adorable, fun kid to hang out with, but like keep it as a side note or side dish to life. Of course, care doesn't really allow for that. And one of the most like exciting realizations of my life, so exciting, I wrote a whole book about it, was that care, all these like epiphanies and lessons I was trying to seek out in my life through doing the kind of things that I thought brought you meaning, which is, taking long road trips or going on meditation retreats or all of our kind of scripts for what people do to become more interesting or deeper people. The experience I had caring for my kid rivaled and really topped any of those. Like seeing, thank you. I saw myself like I've never seen myself, like that caring for that child put up a mirror to myself, but also like an opening for growth. And I also feel like I understood people in the world in a deeper way. And in this conversation, I'll speak specifically how it totally changed my relationship to Judaism and even to this thing that I'll call God, even though I don't know exactly what that means, and I don't expect any of you to either. So it was, I've always enjoyed Jewish culture and ritual. Like it's always been important to me to, to observe the holidays. I think I've had a Seder in my backyard when I lived in Australia, where our table was an old splintery door on 3 crates, and I had also, I remember doing a Seder when I lived in Ecuador. This is referencing when I was traveling the world to try to be deep and interesting. And so it's like it all mattered to me. But there was something about having kids that totally like opened me up to just like the miracle and fragility of creation. Like and really feeling like if we are God's partner, again, I don't know what God means, and don't you expect you to agree with me. If we are God's partner in creation, like what is a more real, rich connection to that idea than making like having a singular consciousness like emerge from your body? It blows my mind. I have 2 kids now. Like I still don't understand. And it was so suddenly like there was something so raw and like almost like a fire lit up in my whole experience of being alive and having any kind of connection with the divine. And so there was that. And then at the same time, my relationship with time, and I think this is a pretty universal experience for parents and all caregivers, was totally warped by care, right? It goes really fast and it also goes really slow and always at the totally wrong moments. And it felt like there was and then the kids keep growing and there's like no it's like, how do I contain this? Like, how do I be in this in any kind of intentional, meaningful way? And it turns out, and Tiffany could tell us a lot about this, there's this great technology called Shabbat. And I now like observe Shabbat in a religious way that I never did in my life. And the energy around the table on Friday nights is truly different than the rest of the week. I mean, our ability to like really pay attention to each other and, from the kids to the grown-ups, to listen to one another, to experience moments of kind of ecstasy and silliness. I'm thinking of many wonderful Shabbats we've had at Deena's house where there's kind of dancing and just joy and singing, and it totally put a charge into this kind of oldest, most fundamental Jewish ritual, which is the Sabbath. And I feel like no one told me that ever. No one said like, care is how you're going to find God, but it is in fact how I found God.
Do either of you want to respond to that? You want to share your own experience?
I think I want to respond because in part it's to both of your points, which is just there's something almost a little tragic about the fact that each person on their own came to this realization of the potency of becoming a mother or providing care in the kind of steady, demanding way that maternal provisions require. And that again speaks to a little bit sad of the deficiency in the cultural landscape, because it's each of us have to use our own hands to turn the light bulb on around this mammalian function, of providing care and maternal care to others. And so again, I just keep coming back to Elissa, to your call that we need to introduce iconography, imagery, so that we're not all left to our own devices, either through becoming a mother or through kind of intensive therapy to restore our relationship to our own mothers. I mean, it's like we're in these private cells trying to recover a maternal aspect that is, of course, it's in the very air that we breathe. And so I guess I'll just share one that I've come to that I really enjoy, which is that the Hebrew root for faithfulness in the Hebrew Bible is Aleph Mem Nun. It's the same root for Amen or ne'eman, to be faithful. It actually has a whole wonderful range of meanings, but it means to be faithful to. Later on in the medieval period, it came to mean to subscribe to a doctrine. So some of you might be familiar with the phrase to believe in the Hebrew. Ani ma'amina be, I believe in one God, Messiah, whatever. But that's a much later development. In the early Hebrew context, to be faithful to another person, basically, is what it is to be aleph mem nunning with someone. And there really might be within that the aim, the mother. Because, and I usually use my hands for this, but where did we come up with this notion of faithfulness if it isn't through the firsthand experience of the concrete, steady, necessary presence of another person providing care? And so every time we say amen, and also what's beautiful is that it's also, because of in Christianity, amen, it's such a strong, or amin in the Arabic, it's everywhere. And if you like, with each recitation of that, I stand faithfully with you, I'm standing with you, I'm steady with you, I am mother to you, in your recitation of a blessing, you can conjure up the maternal in that very everyday Hebrew word.
That is beautiful.
Yeah, it really is.
As you were speaking, I was sort of thinking about the extent to which I don't think I understood what it was to be a person until I became a mother. Like, there was so much about what we need, what we go through the world invisibly needing, like care, like, the ability to sometimes surrender to something, that I just was blind to until I had a little creature. And I remember the moment, actually, when my son was a newborn, and he was like this kid who, I am a tiny person. He was intended to be a large person, but because he was housed in a small person, came out at like 20th percentile, and had to catch up to 99th percentile. So every time he was awake, he was eating, like always. And I remember at some point thinking, he's so needy. Like, what is with this baby? He's so needy. And then thinking, well, that is a very strange thought to have about a newborn. What do I mean by that? Why am I having that thought? And I thought, I am really not comfortable. I did not understand, like, on a gut level until that moment, that we are all needy, that we all need. We need another. We need care. We need the environment of another relation, another human being in which to come together and to stay together moment to moment. And it is such a bummer that we each have to have that these epiphanies in isolation. The psychoanalyst Joan Raphael Leff, who writes wonderfully about the experience, every aspect of the maternal experience, but in particular, she writes about how there is no apprenticeship in our culture for motherhood. That it's sort of like, she gives this analogy, it's like as though like it's their first day of graduate school, and then the next day they're a full professor. And like, you don't get to go through, being a graduate student, writing your dissertation, just like, boom, you got this kid, you're doing it. And I see so many ways it gets perpetuated, and I'll just share one anecdote that feels very a nice way to wrap up this thought, because I could go in so many directions with it, which is that when my book came out, that's so much about these themes, about like a new narrative for motherhood. I was doing a ton of interviews, and talking about like, the fact that there are a lot of novels coming out lately that are trying to rewrite this narrative about motherhood, that are trying to say, like, motherhood is interesting. Motherhood is art. Motherhood is one of the deepest human experiences, on a par even with, like, erectile dysfunction, which has several thousand books about it. And I had 3 different interviewers ask me the following question that stunned me, each one more than the last, each time I heard it. And that question was, weren't you worried in publishing this book that the market for motherhood narratives was already saturated. And I was like, is the market for war narratives saturated? Is the market for rising up in the mafia saturated? Like, why would the market for one of the most profound human experiences be saturated with a few dozen books? That is stunning to me. And it really highlights the depth of the problem we are up against.
Yeah. And I want to bring it to Judaism. No. I mean, I meant that in like in the like deepest, most basic sense. And I remember I met Deena because someone recommended I speak to her when I started this book. And I remember she said to me, like, it's there. You just have to recover it, which she already illustrated beautifully by teaching us about the roots of amen. And I think, there's so much of my experience of Judaism is a bunch of men sitting in the room talking about abstractions, right? It's like, oh, but if you have this at 4:00, when can you have, if you're talking about kosher laws, can you eat the like ice cream at 6 or is it 6:30? Like, does it matter if it's summer or winter? It's like, it's abstractions. I mean, and that's so much of our experience of Judaism. And just to bring it back again, when I said bring it back to Judaism in like the most basic way, like you think of the 10 Commandments, the first half are about relationships between people. You think about the Torah, where does it start? It doesn't start with rules. It starts about relationships between people, with including like many good mother stories, a deep longing for children, the ambivalence, everything is in there. So I feel like, right, we just sometimes have to remember what's right in front of our faces, that we have this tradition that actually understands that like that relational connection is underneath everything. And, what Deena was saying, right, about that like memory, Charles Darwin thought that. A lot of these wonderful care ethicists, these philosophers who work on care also believe that this parent-child relationship is like this formative moral experience that then from there we build upon. And it's right there in ours too. It's somehow everything got inverted and abstracted to the point where it feels like we're not ever talking about like a relationship between two people, and we're just talking about these large, broad legal concepts to figure out how to be a good person and do right in the world.
The idea that be fruitful and multiply, I believe, is also in one of the books, right? And that there's all this focus on like have the children, and there's a lot of excitement and energy around that, and a lot of when are you going to have the children, and a lot of like I'm going to wait until I have whatever circumstance. But then when you finally have the children, it's like the whole thing just falls off a cliff. Like all not with me and my mother. She was there every Friday taking care of my children. I have to say, I could not have done it without her. And I did not understand her as well until I had children as I do now. I mean, that has been transformative. But as a society, we have such a focus on the independent person that, the person going off on the quest to find themselves, and they can't come home until they do, whereas you're arguing that home is actually where you do find yourself.
One of the places, like not to dismiss other people's meaning-making journeys, but let's just include it. That's all.
Just start with that.
That's all I want.
Start with that.
Yeah.
But this idea of
put it on the menu. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
But that this idea that we're on our own. We're on our own to figure it out. We're on our own to have these revelations. We're on our own for support. We're not set up as we do not have a care infrastructure in the society. Unlike, we're an advanced society, and we are like the lowest on the list of places that support caregiving. So, and I know in your book you're not being prescriptive per se, but you definitely have some ideas about how we could start to shift that. So, I mean, do you want to touch on any of those?
I'll do it by way of anecdote of my personal life. My synagogue has childcare and a really nice lunch, like for a synagogue, but like a good kiddish lunch every Saturday. And when there wasn't a lot to do in the world during COVID, the like not early COVID, but like, 2021, June 2021 COVID, where the world was still kind of shut down, I really started going to synagogue every week. And it was in part because I could pray. And then it was also maybe like a good 65% because I could go on Saturday morning. My kids would go to childcare. They would play in the yard. Someone would feed us. I could sit with friends and talk, and we didn't have to cook or clean. So this is doing two things, right? This is like care infrastructure at my synagogue in Oakland that gives me a break. But it's not just that, and this is an important piece. It's not enough just to support caregivers by letting them not care for a little bit, which all caregivers need. Like, we cannot care alone. We should be in networks of care. That's how humans evolved. But when you make space for caregivers, or really anyone in a dependency relationship, so if you're caring for a parent with dementia, you have a child that moves slowly, thinks slowly, is maybe has any kind of handicap, disability. When you make space for them, you're also allowing them to be leaders. You're allowing their voices. If my kids to be heard in that community, my kids are in childcare, I can actually have the bandwidth to give the drosh that week. And maybe even in my drosh, I could share some of the wisdom I've learned from being a mom. And so I think this is really like what we need to have happen I think more in the Jewish community, is not to think of it as merely like support from, just kind of offsetting the burden, but actually like hear those voices. Let that sisterhood be the rule makers, all of our bubbies, like put them in, like hear what they have to say, not just like what's a nice kiddish lunch, once a year, but like put them on the bima, let them talk. Yeah.
Well, you also talk about the bringing the wisdom that we get from caring for others into other aspects of our lives, and and this idea of kind of the arc of going from keep my work life and my kid life totally separate. And some people have had to do that in order to get ahead in work. And I mean, I think actually that's just been the norm, like as far back as I can remember. But I attended a talk the other night where it was a panel of 4 women, and one of them said, and I just love this, I lead at work. I lead like a mother, and at home I mother like a leader. And I just thought that just totally sums it up. Like, why can't that just be like the mantra, as opposed to it being like a problem that you have kids and they get in the way of getting, the work done at work. But now there's a question.
We learn from everything we do, and we bring it into everything else we do, and that's good. That's like being a thoughtful human that is trying to continually grow and find new ways to connect. So, yeah.
Well, what about this idea of, so we've talked a lot about caring for others, but also allowing yourself to be cared for. And I think you talk about it like if you're an Olympic athlete, like you have to take breaks and you have to get breaks. But I
like care is kind of like an Olympic sport.
It's kind of like,
I mean, you kind of are. Like if you have a toddler or a parent with dementia, like it's a little bit like prepping for the Olympics, but like the Olympics never come and end.
It's like it never ends. Well, how can we all open ourselves up to accepting being taken care of? I think it's hard. I mean, do you think it's hard, or is that just like something that comes? I mean, what do you guys think?
I'm looking at Yael because you used the word surrender before, and in my mind I was like, how do we do that?
I think it's this is the anecdote that's coming to my mind, which is going to sound very strange, but bear with me. I went to the doctor's office a few months ago, and usually, when they take your blood pressure and you give them your arm, and every other time in my life that I'd given them my arm, someone would have to say to me, no, relax, like let it go, relax into my hand, and I'd be like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And this time I just naturally did it, and I started to tear up, like with the idea that I could that there was a hand there to relax into and to let go into. And this was this moment where I was like, oh, analysis is working. You know what I mean? Like I know something is shifting where I know how to be cared for. I know how to surrender into an environment that is not myself, that I'm creating at every moment. And I think for each of us, it's incredibly complicated, and it's different for each of us because the obstacles for allowing ourselves to be cared for have to do with what it was like to be cared for as a child, how that went right, how that went wrong. It always went wrong in some ways. It didn't always go right in some ways. And I think having our own kids and taking care is actually a huge part often of how we learn how to do that. I mean, we see, like, you're talking about how you've come to know your mother better through being a mother, and I'm really curious to hear more about that. For me, it was the act of caring, like how much I loved my son. It was a love unlike any, a revelatory love that you feel. You're like, this is how much my mother loved me? Oh my God. Like I can sort of surrender into a love like that. Like now that I understand what that is, how much she wants to care for me, what it does, if she feels like me, like I do when I'm caring for my son, like I can surrender to that more easily. And it became easier actually to sort of say to my mother, like, I'm out. Take care of it.
Well, Deena, do you want to share any of your own personal experiences as a mother? We've looked at you as a religious scholar, but you are also a mother, and I'm sure you can bring one thing into the other if you want to.
I love that question. She told me she would ask me that, and I meant to think about the answer first.
I know there's a million answers, right?
I think what I would say is that the demands of child rearing and how constant they are is in part why I started to realize that constancy is arguably the most defining characteristic of the mother, which is why the Hebrew root is so exciting to me, that the word for being constantly supportive of and faithful to might actually have the aim, the mother, folded into it. I think some of that is that I experienced the constant demands of child rearing. It was so intense, maybe because of the nature of my kids, especially my first kid. So it led to a kind of exaggerated almost awareness of what constant care feels like when it's done in the isolation of the nuclear family and not within the networks that ideally it was meant to be. I never felt that the demands of the dyad always felt unnatural to me. It's not natural to the maternal relation that it be so narrow. But that's how I experienced it as someone living in a nuclear family. And so what happened is I teach Jewish studies, and I took the intensity of that was almost a trauma, and it opened something for me, which is that I then could say, oh goodness, it became interesting to me, as you said. What is happening in this relationship is my children are becoming who they'll be as a person for the rest of their lives. So the mood of the household, the tones of the household, the nature of the holding, the rhythms of work and rest, music, sounds, all of these things are basically marking my child as I've been marked by my past. And so as a Jewish historian, I thought, oh my goodness, actually that's the story of Jewish history. And it's not my argument that some constant, unchanging little formula of Jewishness is just being passed down static all through the generations and regions of Jewish life. It's utterly changing, changeable, mutable all the time. The household is where the stuff is performed and altered. It's where Jewish languages develop. Ladino, Yiddish, Judeo-Arabic, Arabic, Polish, Slavic, it's all happening there. The child learns to speak in the household. So I'm trying to rewrite, in a way, the story of Jewish history, where the household becomes a central node in the telling of Jewish history. We're used to thinking about the twin settings of the temple and then the synagogue as a shorthand. And the JCC, as a shorthand for Jewish history. And it also provides a periodization of sorts, because we think temple, oh, that's ancient times, and synagogue is shorthand for the rabbinic phase, and we understand Jewish history. But all along, and arguably more foundational, and in interesting ways more continuous, was everyday household life. And so if we look, for example, in ancient Israel, when they uncover, in archaeological digs, sites of ancient Israel, there's no synagogue. There's not even an obvious a communal structure of any kind. Archaeologists rely exclusively on household evidence for the fact that this little settlement seems to be marked differently from the Canaanites next door kind of thing. So I guess what I would say is that I took what was maybe, as I said, the kind of difficulty of motherhood and applied it to an understanding of the Jewish past and present, ideally with the hope. I often think of the verse from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Hachut ha-mishulash lo bimhera yinatek. The threefold cord is not easily sundered. So what's the threefold cord? If we broaden Jewish history to think about this tripod almost of synagogue, of temple, and then household, and of course household captures the maternal relation, and in my own fantasy, like your synagogue depiction, the network of care relations within which Jewish forms are practiced and changed and unfold over time.
Wow. Did becoming a mother send you on this path of investigation? Or were you already?
Yes, but it's even a little more acute than that, is what I'm saying. Becoming a mother and being overwhelmed by the constant demands of it made me extremely sensitive to what goes into it. Also, I'll say another thing. I'm from New York. Anybody from New York here? Woo! Where, my Jewishness was very much not just in the circle of the household. There was like a street Jewishness that I took for granted. And then I moved to the Bay Area in 2006. And that was the other acute thing that happened. It was like my house was where Jewishness was happening. And if I made a trip to synagogue or maybe to Oakland Kosher, but it was like unbelievable, the ambient Jewishness that I took for granted in a place more densely and culturally Jewish in New York. The absence of that, which I actually grieve, it's like a piece of me is really missing. But it also then made me more aware of the importance of the household, so I could write about it a bit.
Well, that is a great prompt for my final question. But before I ask it, I want to say we're going to open it up to your questions. So if you have thoughts you want to articulate, think about that. What would you say? This is I've tried to avoid saying, and now you answer, and now you answer, and now you answer, but I'm going to put you all on the spot right now, which is to say, what is it about Jewish mothers that society could use a little more of, as opposed to being made fun of, where we started?
Love.
Aww.
I feel like Jewish moms love their fucking kids. Not everyone, but it's a pretty. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry.
She liked you.
Yeah. Well, of course, my 5 or 6, my 5 or 6-year-old would also like an answer with a bad word in it. Yeah. All right. That's a good age. Yeah.
Yael or Deena, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe building on the love, I think like if we take the sort of exaggerated caricature of the Jewish mother as smothering, I think if you flip that around, that's the consistent maternal environment. That's the mother as atmosphere in which you form as a human being. And I think acknowledging the tremendous, the largeness of that, we could use more of that.
And then I would add the practical, or you use the word technology aspect, Elissa, that you referred to earlier, which is that many Jewish practices are practices of everyday life. I mean, one of the very typical ways that people kind of compare Jewish culture to other religions is that, Judaism is not something you go and do, exclusively when you go to some large towering place of worship. It's actually a whole set of practices that can inform everyday life. We talked about Shabbat with food, song. So Jewish mothers, or maybe more broadly Jewish culture, has a lot to offer in the way of making our everyday lives more life-affirming through regular practices. I mean, we're at a time right now, I think, we're all, pop culture is letting us down in terms of life-affirming habits. And especially rabbinic teachings are just so filled with habits that can be life-affirming, can affirm family relationships. So there's a kind of, it's like a treasure. We're lucky that we have it that can guide us in a time really of such kind of cultural disarray.
Thank you. All right, does anyone have questions they'd like answered? Tiffany.
I was curious, you just said you're a child. I was curious the ages of your children because I feel like it is really an evolving feeling now that I have a 21-year-old and a 15-year-old, how it's really, and when they become more independent and my 21-year-old is, in college. And I'm just curious how your sense of any of these, I was curious, I know your age kids, I know you're both of yours, but what are your
9 and 11.
Okay. Because it is interesting, and maybe Lauren can answer this, but like how it's changed now that your kids are out of the house, because that's this whole other evolution of all these things we're talking about, when they don't need you every second, and it's been super interesting. I was just wondering.
I mean, the word that I've used to describe the feeling of them being out of the house, which was actually really surprising, I'll just lead by saying, I was told I could just carry my kid around like a football. Like I would just bring them, everywhere, and my life wouldn't change, and I would just like keep doing all the same things I was always doing. And of course, that's not actually how it turned out. But I did try and bring them into a lot of situations that you wouldn't necessarily bring a child into, not in any bad way, but. So I guess I realized that I was actually really quite connected to these kids. And so one left, and then the second one left to go to school. And the word that I've been using to describe how it feels is untethered. I'm sort of like flapping around going, what am I, where's my center? Which is kind of ties to the name of you have a piece coming up of yours. So it's just a different feeling, and I think we have to be different people when our kids leave the house. That we need to give them the respect that they've deserve and the independence that they've earned, while still retaining our relationship with them, just in a different, evolving way. Yeah.
I just wanted to commend those moms with the younger children, because you guys are all sitting up on a panel and you all have intellectual lives. And I'm an author too. I'm also a single mom. I wrote a book about it called Reconceptions. And I also had that, I think you talked about that feeling of like, you have to go out. So many people are like, I'm going to go on a retreat. I'm going to go traveling to find myself. And I think there's also something about the constriction of becoming a mother, and not having that freedom that forces you inward as a thinker and as a writer, and as that actually is more expansive in certain ways than having the total freedom to go out and find yourself. And I just want to commend you for that. I mean, and I also just want to say that 2 years ago during the pandemic, my best girlfriend and I rented a Sprinter van, and we took 3 kids on this crazy adventure where we visited 7 national parks. And that wasn't a combination of the both. We were like, it was like Thelma and Louise with kids.
And I but
actually
not
really
like
wanna see that
Thelma and
movie.
Louise.
No. That's what we would joke about. We
came
like,
back.
there were days that we wanted to throw the kid, like not blow up the guy with the crazy car, but like throw the kids out the van. But I just want to say that, like, I think the combination of the constriction and the freedom is really a beautiful, beautiful thing. And thank you for speaking to that contradiction and
Thank you.
That is
Beautiful.
Yeah. I love the way that you put that. And I have to say, like, I I wrote a whole novel that is a multi-verse novel that is about that. It's like, why is it like the cosmic and the cozy are the same thing, right? The going inside and the going wide, they're part and parcel. You know, it's the going in that's the going wide. And as a single mother who shares custody, that the untethered, like when you're saying that, I was like, oh yes, like every time my son is not with me, suddenly I'm like, what is the shape of my life? And I have to sort of remember, like, what is the shape of anything? I'm like an item of clothing that's like not on a hanger and not worn, it just falls to the floor. And it's like, I'm like, yeah, I might complain about how hard it is, but this is what gives it shape. This is what gives it meaning. This is what gives it the expansiveness. And it's both.
Hi, I'm in the middle of your book, so don't give it away. And I have a kind of complicated question about it. I think that I'm in Barnard Book Club with your roommate, Crucial, and I kept on asking to read your book, and we read it, but I'm dyslexic, I'm a slow reader, so I'm not done yet. And I just am a little confused, but I want to know, is it like Melanie Klein's Splitting? And are you inspired by Octavia Butler and writing your own kind of gospel? And is she two people or one? I'm so confused, but I'm enjoying it so much. And if I don't get to have the answer, that's okay, because it's fiction.
Well, I would say I love this question, and I love that at the beginning of this question, I didn't know if it was for me or for Elissa, and by the middle, I was like, oh, it is for me. Yeah. It is 100% for me. Well, let me start by saying I like that you are confused, because part of what I was trying to do with this book is reproduce the profound dislocation and disorientation of early motherhood, where you're just like, that ordinary breakdown of who am I? What am I? What is my life? And then you sort of rebuild something. That was sort of what I wanted to capture. You will become less confused, is my hope, as you go on. In terms of Melanie Klein and Splitting, I love that interpretation. I never thought of that, but I love Melanie Klein. It makes a lot of sense. Octavia Butler is one of my favorite writers of all time. I would never have said I was creating a gospel, but why not? Yes. What was the last question? Whether you're going to become less confused, or what was? Oh, are there two people? Well, I mean, so the whole, I use the multiverse as this metaphor in some sense for the worlds within us. Right? It's like, we walk around with these worlds within worlds within us. As a psychoanalyst, you would call it object relations, which I'm assuming since you asked about Melanie Klein. And that we're only partially aware of. We become aware as they sort of affect our lives. And to me, that is what is so interesting about the multiverse. I think that's why we're obsessed with the multiverse, actually, is because it speaks to something profound about our psychological experience. And so in some sense, the answer is, yeah, I guess on some metaphorical level, it's two people, in the sense that we're walking around with so many selves that aren't integrated. And then on like a pure plot level, no, it's no.
Thank you. So many really wise and beautiful and profound things coming out tonight. I was actually really interested in Deena's comment. You sort of mentioned the word trauma, that intensity of caring for these very young children, and the constancy of it was this trauma. And that was the first time that I'd ever heard it described that way, and it absolutely resonates with me. 100% motherhood has been a trauma in some senses. And I think if we're talking about things being big and important and worthy of important thought and critical, I think we have to sort of acknowledge that the outcome isn't necessarily wonderful and beautiful and easy. I think that it is also sort of traumatic. And I think that's why I found sort of narratives of motherhood to be quite unsatisfying in a way, because I think, I sort of hear it's a loss of self, in the sense of you kind of feel not yourself and your hair won't look nice, or but there's something, I think the understanding of it as trauma sort of speaks to the profundity. It's just a sort of flip of the like extreme self-actualization is the extreme trauma of this experience. And I'm glad to have that named in a way. And so I just wanted to sort of appreciate that. And I think also quite often we sort of talk about motherhood and there's all these ways to sort of explain it away by all these other reasons why it's traumatic, like because of the patriarchy or because of the, you know, the social policy or because we don't have paid leave, or all of which I am 100% in, you know, I support all these things, but, you know, because of the nuclear family and all of these things. But I think there's something intrinsic to the experience which is profoundly like traumatic. And I say that in the sense to give it more weight and importance than I think that has ever gotten. And it's just maybe the flip of the thing. So I don't know if that you could speak a bit to that point. Thank you.
I'm looking at the therapist next to me. I hope you'll have something to share to kind of to remedy or to meet it in a way that can make it bearable, and then we can work with it. But yes, it's a strong word. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, you know, like my daughter, God bless her, she's doing great, but she benefited from a lot of therapies in her early months and years to help her with like gross motor movement and symmetrical movement development and stuff, which is how I came to know the work of Moshe Feldenkrais, because the Feldenkrais sessions we were doing for her were really helping her. But if I could tell you the subtlety of these sessions, if you're unfamiliar with them, you won't even believe me. I mean, it is basically looks like gentle play, maybe. But it is a session of extreme attunement between the therapist and the child through movement and touch that enables the child's whole neurosystem to kind of activate more optimally. But it was very clear to me in those sessions that the touch and the interactions of the Feldenkrais method was absolutely on a spectrum with parenting. It was not other than the parental touch. It was just a kind of potentized parental touch. And so again, just to add to, so I also had a kind of medical, you know, situation and framework through which, again, I came to perceive of family relations and child development more generally. So even peekaboo as a game that assists the child in attaining a more regularized sense of the environment and relying upon the environment. Or even, it's interesting, but think about like this little piggy. That I invite you to try this if you like. If you have a little child in your life and you play this little piggy with them, where you apply absolute interest in the experience of touch with each finger, you will watch the child drop into the same fullness of interest in themselves. And possibly even from a movement perspective, possibly even acquire a slightly more full sense of kind of like the map of their person. Those games are really serious. So I came to the seriousness of those games, and I guess to some extent the seriousness of parenting, from a little bit of a wound, you know? So in my own life, I think, for my own wellness, you know, I'd like to lift out, if possible, from the kind of state of such hyper awareness of what it takes, you know, so that hopefully that will come. But thank you for your comment.
Hi, thank you. Hi. So nice to be here amongst all of you and the four of you. Just to build on what you're saying, Deena, reminds me, I too came into motherhood through some medicalization. And the only time I've done trauma therapy was around my son's birth and all the medicalization that was horrific and also saved him. At some point, and he was in PT from the time, I don't know, from the start. And he would play with my ear in this very special, invested way. And the physical therapist said to me, well, at this age, he still doesn't know the difference between his body and yours. He doesn't know where one ends and begins. And I took that as a kind of practice of the Shema. That's what that meant to me. And it took him a long time. I don't know if anyone knows what proprioception is, but it's how you know where your body is in space. And he's still working on that well into, But I think about that in the context of the Shema. It's like a salve or a balm to some kind of pulsing of tether, untether, here, not here. And that it's not one or the other, but one whole thing. So anyway, I just wanted to share that about the child's development that I heard. It may be a rumor. Don't know, but anyway, thanks.
Why is there so many questions?
Isn't that what Judaism is? Just one big question. It
Look,
never
the
ends.
club, yeah.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share or ask? I love this has turned into a sharing session.
Why are there so many questions, or the? I love. This thing about the Shema is beautiful. I will say. I have a couple of things, and this also speaks to the sort of trauma question together. I think I will say, I wrote a book about birth trauma, and so I got a lot of birth trauma stories. People send me a lot of emails about their birth trauma. I had no idea before this how common, like even births that you think, didn't go wrong, how much normal trauma there is in that experience. Because when you think about it, it is the closest most of us come to death, until we come close. And we don't normalize that enough. We don't have enough ritual around that. Other cultures, there's ritual around the fact that you've passed through something holy. You've passed through something terrifying. We don't do that. We're like, it's all good. Your baby's fine. And that's a problem. I think that's a real problem. And so I think like the fact that you found something holy and religious in that, to me, that is such a beautiful statement to you finding your way to the wholeness that I think we all need, like the sort of sense of ritual and community that we all ought to have around something as actually normally traumatizing as birth. And then I think, speaking to the idea of trauma of everyday parenting, I just want to normalize that. I think we don't normalize that enough because we want to speak to this myth of merger, that we're one with our children, that we love to be one with our children. And we want to sort of pretend that any difficulty does come from the society, so that if it's incredibly hard, it's because it's because of the patriarchy, which it is, but we haven't fixed the social safety net, and but in fact, what we are being asked to do as caregivers is to take our children's, emotions that are way too big for them, that they can't name, to metabolize them within ourselves and to give them back to them in a way that they can form, that they can handle, that they can make something of, that they can make use of. That is unbelievably difficult emotional and intellectual work that we are asked to do every minute of every day that we are caregiving. That's wild. And that really can be deeply traumatizing depending on what is being given to you by this particular child. And I wish we spoke about that so much more. And I know that you speak about that more in a book that is coming out in June, and that is beautiful, called Boy Mom, that everyone should read.
Wow. There we go. Ruth Whitman, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and thank you for being such a wonderful panel. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah.